All right, so I've got a whole host of things that I kind of started to prepare. So we're going to start with a pair of pliers. So here's what I did with my pair of pliers. Remember, this set I was able to take apart. So whenever I took these images, I just kind of took these on my back deck. It was sunny out that day, I was in the shade. So it kind of gave an even light overall. There's a little bit of reflection on it, but you can see I suspended these above the rail with just, I used a pill bottle to do it. You could use anything really. The idea is to minimize the amount of space that the object is actually to minimize the surface that the object is actually contacting so that you can isolate it easier, all right? So I shot it once all together, and I shot each half, all right, to put this one together. And when I did that, I took these I went in Photoshop. And I just isolated them. So if I turn off my layer mask here, I cropped in on them and I isolated them. And I'll show you a couple of ways to isolate those here in a moment, a couple of quick ways. The videos that I put up on Canvas do a little more in-depth job. So I'm just going to do it kind of quick so we can move through these so I can move on to other stuff, how to animate it, but just to give you an idea. So I cropped these. And actually, I'll delete this layer mask. So you can isolate these objects in a couple of different ways once you've shot them. You can use the pen tool, which I have a tendency to do because I like getting it. I've used the pen tool for a long time. I'm comfortable with it. A lot of people aren't. If you're not comfortable with the pen tool in Photoshop or Illustrator or anything else, using it is the only way to get used to it. And it's got a lot of key commands that help make the job faster and easier. Once you get used to it, it's a great way to outline things. But if I zoom in here, I can use the pen tool to just sort of draw a path around my object. Turn on something here real quick. All right. And you can outline with the pen tool just by going around the perimeter of it. So that is probably the most accurate way to go at it. You get more control. The automated methods do an okay job, but you still have to be able to go back and fix those. So once you get that object outlined, you need to create a mask out of it. So using a pen tool is one way to do it. And I'll just save that path I started. Another way to go about it is within Photoshop, it's got some decent presets. Let's see what, so in the latest Photoshop, you'll get this little bar. If you select remove background, let's see what that does. That does a pretty decent job. It eliminated all the background. It just didn't get the section of the cap of the pill bottle that I used to support everything, and it didn't get the hole in the middle of it. But it works out pretty well. I mean, if I zoom in on it, there are some areas that I need to clean up. Some little areas in here. And I don't think it really quite accurately captured this edge. So it works, it's good for, even if you just want to quickly get these roughed out so you can assemble them and then import them into After Effects to do tests with them. Maybe doing it this way is a good way to do it to start with, but at some point you're probably going to want to go back and make sure that it's clean and sharp. Remember, part of the grading on this assignment is craft, so if you've got a lot of extra background around your image and it looks kind of rough and raggedy, it kind of counts off against you. So you always want to make sure that it looks as good as it can possibly look, all right? Pen tool, I think, is the best way. This is a good way. The other way to do that works pretty much the same way is on my toolbar, if I go down here to the object selection tools, if I click and hold on that, there's several options here. You can just click, and I drew guidelines in here so I could see where my object was. If you just draw a box around that using the object selection tool, that'll pretty quickly isolate it as well. You see in this case, it actually isolated the cap on this side, but not this side. Regardless, once we make those selections, all we need to do is go back to our layer, and down at the bottom of the layers panel is a mask button. If I click on that, it'll mask out that object, and all I need to do now is to go in and kind of finish cleaning it up. And I can do that by zooming in on it. The way masks work in Photoshop, if you're not familiar, white is opaque, black is transparent. All right? So if you look at, and I'm going to increase the size of my thumbnails here. So here's my mask. If I go get a paintbrush tool with a black fill on it and select the mask itself, reduce the size of my brush. I want to make it a hard brush, and I'm not sure what I was doing last time I did this. Use this tool. It will remember your settings from last time. So you can either paint out those areas that you don't want. If you place your brush right up against that edge and then hold down your shift key, you can do this in short little strokes and kind of quickly zip along the shape that you need to isolate. And I can go in here. Very quickly. Isolate that. So I've got my object masked. I do that with each of my elements, all right? So take a look at the videos that I put up. They do a decent job. Adobe's helpx.adobe.com does a nice job of Photoshop masking as well, explaining the different options you've got. I like using the pen tool ultimately. I find it, at this stage, because I've been using it so long, I find it easiest to use. But this works nicely too. Whenever you're done though, make sure that you save that you have a mask, because you can go back and modify and clean that up, all right? So I did that with this shape. I did it with my other half as well. And here's where using programs together becomes really valuable. So I took these two halves and I created one Photoshop file out of them. Remember, whenever I shot these, I shot the pliers as a whole and I shot the halves. I shot the pliers as a whole for two reasons. One, so I had something to build my pliers from, something as a guide. And two, I wanted this pin in the joint. So I isolated my halves, I put them together in a Photoshop document, and I named all my layers. This is kind of important as well. So I've got the back arm, my front arm, and I've got this pin. And so before I get into After Effects, I'm going to explain why I did this way. When we get this into After Effects, what we want to be able to do is to open and close the jaws of these pliers in a natural sort of way. And you really got to kind of examine the object that you're using. If it's an articulated object like this, with joints that move, identify all those joints that it moves on. The pliers are simple. It's got a single joint that it moves on. So I kept this pin as my joint because I'm going to use that when I get into After Effects to parent my two halves to, which means that any motion that pin makes, my arms are going to follow. Otherwise, I'm left with having to animate 3 different pieces to do any simple kind of a thing, and I don't want to have to do that. That'll make more sense when I show you here in a couple of minutes. 2, that's the point that the pliers are going to hinge on. That gives me something to kind of reference to whenever I set up my center points in After Effects as well. So my planning starts when I'm taking my photos of my objects, all right? The same thing applies when I've got something like a Swiss Army knife. There are somewhere around 8 or 9 different pieces on this. They all joint at a different spot. I've got a couple that joint off this end, some that joint off this end, and then some that joint here in the middle. So identifying all those joints for those individual objects is part of my planning. So I'll show you what I did here. I'm not going to go, that'd take far too long to work with. But I put everything together in a layer in Photoshop because what we can do is I can import this Photoshop document as a composition, and I can retain all of my layers so that when I first open the composition in Photoshop, everything is at my resting point. And all I got to do is start setting up. I don't need to pull in individual files and place them or anything else. So here we've got my pliers in their halves. Everything's named. So now if I go to After Effects, I'll create let's close this. Let's create a new, now let's open After Effects. Create a new project. And I'm going to import a file, just like we've done any of our other files. And here's my plier, my PSD file. So when I select this, I've got some options down here at the bottom. I'm going to import this not as footage. If I import this as footage, it's just going to import a flattened version of my pliers. It's not going to be in parts, in halves. It's just going to be one actor, one part. If I import this, though, as a composition, there are 2 different options here. I'm going to choose composition and retain layer sizes. So it's going to import the document as a comp, but each of my layers are only going to be the size of the object. And I'll do this both ways so you can see the difference. I'm going to start with retain layer sizes. Say open. And leave editable layer styles checked. And what it gives me is a folder that has my layers in it, and when I open my composition, there's my pliers. And down here in my timeline, I have all 3 of my parts. So plan out your object, photography of it, before you bring it into After Effects. The other way to do this is, if you can't take your object apart, like I can't take this object apart and I can't take this object apart, is to shoot it. And then, like I just did with, you got to do a little more work from the standpoint of just outline the individual shapes. One of those will be your top half. Actually, I think I have this one too. Let's see. Not there. Where did I put it? Where did I put it? Other. Oh, come on. Ah, here it is. Here's the hole punch. I did the same thing here that I just described. I started with that image. But I used the pen tool in this case to isolate the top part. That became my top, the top arm. And I used it to isolate the bottom part. And when I was done, I kind of filled in. Turn off that pen. I would have had this area overlapping it. I just kind of cloned in an area to sort of fill that out. Because when I animate this, the hole punch doesn't move very much. I probably wouldn't see all that stuff. But I always take the time to clean things up because I never know what I'm going to want to do with something. I might get some harebrained, silly idea that requires that they're pulled way apart and start to bend or something. At that point, I'm going to wish that I had taken the time to eliminate the part of the overlap here from the top pliers. So take time to, if you can think you might need to do something extreme, take the time to kind of clean all these things up as best you can to start with, so you don't really have to go back. These I did 3 different parts. I also did this tongue part separately because the tongue has to pass in front of the punch area. So if I would have just left this as part of the back arm, I wouldn't have had that. It would have passed in front. It wouldn't have looked right in After Effects. So break these up into as many parts as you need to. All right, back to After Effects. So here's all my parts. And let's say I want to animate this and I want to pull it from one side to another. As it's set up right now, I would need to select all these items. Keyframe it, go over here, move it in, keyframe them all individually. That gets kind of tedious, especially when you need to start opening and closing things. The more keyframes you have to deal with, the more complicated life becomes, all right? The more opportunity for missing things, difficulties arising. So we always kind of want to build things in a way that allow us to easily animate. And that's actually what I've done here. So let's start with this pen. This pen, not only do my joints rotate off of that, but any place that pen goes, the arms of the pliers need to go there as well, right? So I'm going to start off by making sure I've got my center point I'm going to select that joint pin, and I'm going to make sure that the center point is sitting right in the middle of it. And it can be kind of hard to see sometimes. Yeah. So it's sitting right in the middle. So if I move this item, it moves by itself. The first thing I'm going to show you is parenting. So for as tiny as this is, I'm going to have this be my parent object. And I'm going to parent both arms of my pliers to that pin. And the way I do that is this. In our timeline, there's a column titled Parent and Link. And it's as simple as telling it, so for my front arm, I want the parent of my front arm to be the joint pin. Or there's this little curly Q, which is referred to as a whiplash. If I select that, I can go over here and drag it on top of that joint pin, and that'll set the joint pin as the parent for the back arm. Now when I select my joint pin and I move it, all of my other objects go with it. You don't have, I'm using an element of my actor to parent to. You could, if you wanted, if you needed something a little larger to work with, there's no reason you couldn't draw a larger, like a shape object, like a rectangle behind your pliers and make it invisible, set its opacity to 0 or something like that, and then parent everything to that. That might give you a larger object to work with. That'd be fine. You just need to parent all of those items to it. In the case of my pliers, this is going to work out okay. But maybe I've got an object where all the parts at some point might want to move independently within the overall movement. I might want to have a null or a secondary a shape that I've actually parented those to, maybe. So multiple ways you can do that. There's no one right or wrong way, but those are a couple of ways you could approach that. All right. So so now I've got the issue of rotating the arms of my pliers. And I've shown you this already, but if I select that, it's going to rotate on the center of that object, and that's not what I want either. It needs to rotate out here. So grab my center point tool again, select this, and I'm going to drag it right over top of the center point of that pin. And I'm going to do that for both my front arm and my back arm. And now when I go back to my rotate tool, much more natural looking. Cool thing is, those movements happen independently of the movement of this pin. So I grab this pin. So let's say I pull this pin now back off here. One thing, if you didn't catch what I just did, so if I know that I want to change the position of this object, I want to animate position of this object, if I just tap the P, with that object closed, if I just tap the P key, it'll open just the position transform option. It doesn't show me scale, opacity, all the other options, only the one I want to work with. If I tap P again, it'll close that. If I tap S, it'll open scale. T is for opacity. O actually does something else, so they do the transparency instead. So you can use your keyboard to open just specific transforms, or you turn down the arrow and it does them all. So let's open the position, and I'm going to set a keyframe for that. I'm going to pull this out here. Oop, wrong order. Leave that back there. Move my playhead forward 1 second. And move that out. So now I've got that. Put this way out. But I can go back. R will open just my rotate on those. I can set those back to 0, their original state. And when I get out here, let's say when I'm halfway, and now when I get out to 2 seconds, maybe I open these up. So I've got 2 separate motions acting within the same object. I didn't have to set the position on these arms because they're following the pin. All I need to focus on is the rotate transform. Not too bad. So, and this actually demonstrates all the things I talked earlier with movements about not doing. But you get the point. You see how it all kind of comes together that way. So, zoom in here. And so we've got that. Stop it. Let's see. What have I got? Okay. Any questions about that? Anything to see again? Okay. So I showed you stop motion last time. This is another way to animate these. This is a perfectly good way to do it as well. All right. If you've got an object that's not articulated, that's fine. Somebody mentioned a piece of paper at one point. A piece of paper might work. There are things we can do with that as well. An object like this would probably work. It's not really articulated, but there are ways we can bend this and make it do certain things. A wrench isn't articulated. But again, ways using the puppet pen tools, we can distort this and deform it. So things we can do with them, all right? Even something as simple as a jump drive in one of these things, I mean, all sorts of things we could probably do with this, you know? So if you've got, I mean, hopefully that kind of helps you start thinking about the objects you've picked. Maybe you're thinking of it the same way, but maybe it gives you other ideas, you know? You can do as much with all this as you want, as much or as little, really. I really don't want to hinder you at all with what you do, but just, you know, give thought to your objects and how they move and how you're going to have them move. So I want to take this, and if there are no other questions thus far, I can select keyframes, by the way, move my playhead, and paste those keyframes, one at a time. Copy, or even arrange. All right, so they open and they close now. All right. So that's basic motion on that. I did the same thing with, I'll just show you, actually I won't even. If I import, there it is. Cancel. select that as a, lots more objects there. Let's do, oh, I'll do this one without retain. So I did retain layer sizes before. If I don't select the retain layer sizes, what it will do is still import my file just the same way it did, but each object will have the physical size of the entire composition, which isn't really, becomes difficult to manage, I think, in a lot of cases. So if I were to choose composition, when I open this up, each of my objects is the size of the entire composition area rather than just the shape of the object. Those become a little more difficult to work with. So, but if I import that file, instead of footage, composition, retain layer sizes, what did I do? I did something backwards. Import file. Oh. Right. PSD. Composition. There we go. You see, my Swiss Army knife is considerably more complex, but by identifying all these pins, we got to kind of, with some stuff like this, you got to kind of examine it, use your imagination a little bit. What might this look like inside? If I turn off the face of it, you'll see that each of these shapes, I kind of marked that rotation point with I put a mark in the layer in the file, but I kind of cut these in because that's actually what they do inside of the knife. When you examine it, you kind of figure that out. But when you're building objects like this, make an effort to try to make them as real world as you can, or as realistic, because a lot of times when you close this stuff up, you'll get unwanted kinds of things. So if I'd have left this notch in here, when I close it up, I'd have this big notch sticking up above the top of the knife, and that's not something I would have. So I put a lot of emphasis on prep and setup, because if you take the time to prep it and set it up right, the animation part gets easier as well. So anyway, that's that one. So if I go back into my pliers, let's look at a couple of things here. All right, so I've animated this. I bring it in, the jaws open and they close. Great. It's not very lifelike though. So let's talk a little bit about easing. So easing basically the different easing styles allow you to ease objects from one position to another and from one movement into another. So I'm just going to look at the position of this pin. We're going to focus on it for now. All right, there's that. And there are my two keyframes. I want to ease into this keyframe right here. If I right click, if I have that keyframe selected and I right click on it or control click, one of the two, at the very bottom is a keyframe assistant. And you'll see that there are a couple of options here. Easy ease, in and out. So I want to ease my motion into that point. So I'm going to select easy ease in. And you'll see that the keyframe changes, the style of it, so you know what you've applied. So if I go back and do this again, you see how that kind of eased into that a little bit more? It wasn't quite, it didn't come to such an abrupt halt. If I undo that, it sort of thuds into place. That eases in a little bit more. And that may or may not be enough, but it's a start anyway. So one way I can adjust that even further, if I want, is actually I find the rest of this to actually work better in curves graph. So I'm going to sort of make that a little smaller and scale this up. So we're working in keyframes right now, keyframe mode. There's this icon sitting along the top of our animation pane, and this is our graph editor. And if you open it up, actually, let me go back and select these two keyframes. Now if I open that graph editor up, that's that easy ease motion within the context of a value graph. There are two different kinds of graphs. There's a speed graph and a value graph. Value graph is the one most people work in. Speed graph is a little more touchy. But if I'm going to zoom in on this just so I can see it better. So as this moves along, and I'm just going to drag my playhead, as it gets closer, you see how that curve flattens out? It gets closer to its destination faster, and then it slowly kind of eases into it. So if let me make an adjustment here. There we go. All right. So if we watch that come across, it just sort of eases into it. I can slow down the pace of that by moving my playhead, say, to here. And I can add a new keyframe in here, which I'll just go back here to my position. And if I come all the way over here to the left, there's this little button right here. Click on that, that'll toss another keyframe in place. I can select that keyframe and slide it up. You see how my pliers are moving along the timeline as I do that? Now when I play this, they get to that point, but it eases even more into that position. So I can control the easing that way. And I can, maybe I get him there real fast and ease him in. So and this is kind of where playing around comes in a little bit. If you rewatch this demo, get to this part, stop it, play around with these points and see what you get. Whatever you do though, you want to make it, sort of set it so that it's a natural kind of a feel. All right. So that's one way to do this. If I go back to my timeline, you'll see that there's the keyframe that I added in. And it's got an easy ease applied to it. So this easy ease icon, just so you know, actually looks like this. You can't tell. Ease in just looks like an arrow that goes that way. Ease out looks like an arrow that goes that way. And if you do an easy ease, which is a combination of the two, it's basically that shape. So as you're looking at your animation timeline, if you see those icons, that's what's going on. Any question with that you want to see again? We can combine that movement. With some scaling, maybe. Did I show you how to loop a movement last time? Did I show you looping? Okay. We can also apply these easing motions to the opening and closing of these jaws. So maybe, let's take a look at these. So maybe when they open, we come across here and we ease into that state. If I right click on that, I can ease into that. See how it kind of changes that movement a little bit? Maybe I want them to clamp down hard and fast. Actually, let's do it this way. Let's shorten the timeline up. Let's try that. A little more abrupt. So I've got overlapping movements and motions with the jaws opening at the same time. Actually, let's take all of these and move them back. There we go. The jaws are opening as it comes into play, eases in, and then they close. If I make I did that. I'm going to copy all of these and make a new composition. Oh, this was a very large file, by the way, when I did this. If I look at my composition settings for this, I leave them at the size I bring them in. Just because I want to do a 1920 by 1080 animation doesn't mean that my actors have to be that size. I leave them nice and big, so I've got the latitude to scale them down and scale them up as I want to. So all of your compositions don't need to be that size, the 1920 by 1080, but your final composition needs to be that size, all right? So, new players. Actually, I'm just going to copy and paste that composition and open it up. And go back here to beginning. And erase all of my. You can erase a timeline, an action along a timeline, just by clicking on the stopwatch again, and it'll erase all the objects on it. All right. So, oops. Let's grab the pin. All right. So, let's do this. I'm going to open these, close all these up. Rotate, and I'm gonna set that keyframe, and then let's do this again. All right. So I do that. That's pretty slow. So, pull this in, speed that up a little bit. Just go to 20 frames. Let's see what that gives us. That'll be good for an example. All right. So if I select all of these, I can apply, I'm going to apply Easy Ease to all of them. You'll see that it's going to, the motion to open is going to be a little slower. It's going to speed up in the middle and then slows down at the end. If I go into my timeline, that's what that looks like. When I use Easy Ease though, I get handlebars on my points within this graph editor. So I'm just going to grab these and slide them over a little bit so that they open a little quicker. If I slide them this way, I can also pull these handlebars and adjust that curve. It starts to feel a little more natural than it did in the first place. And then for each one of these, so if I want to loop this over and over again, say I've got my pliers as my main actor, but maybe I'd use them again as a secondary actor or as a supporting cast that just sort of moves by in the background with its jaws opening and closing over and over again. I can either go through and copy and paste keyframes over and over again over a 20-second, 30-second, maybe 60-second composition to make that happen. Or I can use a script. So, and I want you to see scripting so you know that it's there and so you know it can be done. And if you want to do it, ask, or you can look it up. But within After Effects, you can write scripting, and one of the things we can do is a loop. So I've got, and actually I'm going to delete actually no, we'll keep them all. So I'm going to go here to these last, I don't think it really matters that I use the last keyframe or not. But on my rotation, if I hold down my Option key and click on that, the right key. Why is it being a pain for me today? Holding down the Option key should open a scripting bar, but it's not. I don't know why. Sometimes that happens. Software can be, it's supposed to be you hold down the Option key and it opens a scripting line where you can type in a piece of script. There's, with only 2 keyframes selected, and I'll show you this on Monday. I'll go through it again. But with only a couple of keyframes selected, if I set this to loop, it'll just repeat that motion over and over again until the end of the composition. But what's nice about that is if I need to make an adjustment in the speed of it, I only have to make the adjustment to 1 or 2 keyframes, and it'll play out over the course of the entire composition. Whereas if I copy and paste keyframes over 60 seconds, I've got to make adjustments to all of those, which becomes very tedious and time consuming and really just burns time is all it does. So we can loop repetitive actions that way. Most of your animations probably won't use repetitive actions, but something like this might. So another thing that's worth pointing out is whenever I import a file, I can also import other After Effects files and all of their elements. So if I go, I've got animated object 3, I have a wrench. And I'm going to open that. And you'll see that it brings in my wrench actor. And here's my layers. And here's my wrench. So now I've got him available to use in my composition as well. And here's an example of looping. And this uses the Puppet Pen tools, but I have 2 keyframes in this, but I've got a loop script set up so it just sort of wiggles them back and forth. And I'll show you how to do that. Actually, we'll look at the Puppet Warp tool on Monday. But by way of building out your compositions, you're building multiple actors. You can build them in their own files and then import them into a master composition if you want. So if I open this composition up, I can bring my wrench in here, scale that down, and maybe I duplicate him a few times. The more I have going on, the slower my preview gets. But so I've introduced that secondary animation of those wiggling wrenches into it. Let me slide this guy up. So I'm combining other compositions inside of my master composition. It looks kind of goofy with them all being in sync and in time, but I could select these and slide them around. Maybe I slide these. Actually, if I pull back out here, you'll see what I'm doing. I'm actually just sliding the position of these a little bit. So that when they wiggle, they're not so synchronized. So you can move your compositions around that way to sort of retime. That's another way to retime particular objects. Repetitive things like this, it's nice to make sure that you make a clip that's plenty long so that you can slide those around and don't have to worry about getting to the end and something disappearing on you. Slide them down. And then from a standpoint of basic compositional kinds of things, if we've got depth, we can, these are all the same weight. There's not a lot of depth in this. But if I select, this guy's smaller, maybe it's because he's further away, I can open him up. Maybe I'll just hit T for opacity, and I can scale my opacity back on it so that I start giving some depth in my composition. So we've got a little more depth now kind of coming into play. Consider your environment, where your scene is set. Create a background that'll work well with that as well. You can also animate your background. I mean, if it's, you know, if your animation is a balloon floating on the wind, I mean, maybe you put a background in where you animate maybe some clouds floating by and that kind of stuff. All these kinds of secondary elements, all right? You can also let's see, let's do this. Let's put so let's get rid of all these guys. I don't want those guys. And let's pull this back down. What am I looking for? Let me try. You know, create multiple compositions of your actor to kind of cut them together. So maybe I've got one animation of him, maybe his jaws are opening and closing over and over. Let's take a look at this one. Just don't save that. Oh. So here's kind of taking some of those actors. Now I've introduced another one. It's kind of primary and secondary. So so play around with it, have fun. For Monday, I'll go through, we'll look at easing a little bit more, creating multiple compositions to create different effects within your movie. Maybe I want to do some jarring, cuts where my pliers guy is far away, closer, closer, closer. I can set those up in separate compositions and combine those all together in my master composition. So just do some examples of that. I mean, kind of trying to feed you ideas, ways to approach things. So it's easy to get wrapped up in how do I do this little thing? How do I do that little thing? One of the things that I find it usually pretty helpful to do is I'll set aside time to do one certain thing, but at some point or another, I'll set aside time to step back and look at something totally different. So it's easy to get caught on making an animation, making something move a certain way, focusing on that, and forgetting about overall your composition, your staging, your cuts back and forth between different things. So I'll set time aside to look at that. I won't even think about my actors, but I'll look at the whole. And so, you know, getting into a practice of allowing you to do that kind of thing can be helpful. It kind of comes back, sometimes it comes back to just playing around as well. So, you know, tinker with it, play around with it. I'm going to